Greetings everyone, let me hope you're doing okay. My name is Brian and I'll be taking you through database programming. So this will be our our second lecture. So we already covered the first lecture, so this is our second lecture. So as I said, I'll be taking you through database programming. So let us see a review of what we covered in our first lecture. In our first lecture, we defined what database is, and we say database is an integrated collection of related data. We described what integrated means, we described what related means, and maybe self-describing. So we learned how to create a database. Then we came across the database application components, where we said we have the tables, we have the codes, we have the application, then we have the queries, we say the tables, application codes, we have the queries, then we have the forms. Then we looked at designing a database, what we need, where we say that we need to get a clear view of what the database we want to design is all about. Then we get the components that will be in our database. Then we identify the details for each of the components. For each of the components we've got, then specify the primary key of the components that we've specified. So today we are going to look at the phases of database design. Phases may be steps that we go through when we want to do something. So in database design, we also go through certain steps for us to come up with a database. And these phases, we have the conceptual database design phase, then we have the logical database design phase, then we have the physical database design phase. So the first phase we go through is what we call the conceptual database design phase. So let us look at the conceptual database design. As we know that the word conceptual comes from the word called concept. Concept is like having the ideas in your head, what you want your database to do and what you want your database to store, right? So we are saying, coming from the word concept, the conceptual database design is a representation of how the database users or owners perceive the database. Perceive the database, like how they want the database to be. So under this database design phase, we get information like what information will be. Sorry, I made a mistake. So we say what information will the database what information will the database store? It was okay. Then which functionalities are needed in the database? So all these are questions we ask ourselves when you are in the conceptual design. Then we ask ourselves, which department will use the database, the one you want to design. So the conceptual is having the concept of how your database will look like. Then you ask yourself, what information will be stored in the database you want to use. Then you say, now what are the functionalities that are needed for me to come up with a database? The functionalities, I mean, what do you want to do? Do you want to just store information? Do you want to delete information? Do you want to update the information? Maybe there are some of the functionalities you ask yourself. Then you ask yourself, which departments are going to use this database? So the first phase for database design is having the concept of how your database should look like. Then after having the concept, then we go to the logical database design. Now logical comes from the word logics. So in this, a logical representation of the database user or owner's perception. Now this one helps us to identify the entities. And after identifying the entities, then you ask yourself, is there any relationship between the entities that I have been identified. So we are saying it helps to answer questions like which type of relationships exist between database entities you've identified. Then how should those relationships be handled? Now the relationships I will talk of one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many, but we shall look at that at a later stage. But now under this is where we identify those relationships. Then we ask ourselves, how can we handle the relationships that we've identified? So during this database design phase, database design user comes up with the following diagrams. So we shall also learn how do we draw these diagrams. That is the ER diagrams and the RM diagrams. The ER diagrams are also referred to as the entity relationship diagrams. Then the relational model diagrams, we shall also learn how to draw them. And this is all under the logical database design. So when we're done with the logical database design as identifying the relationship between the entities you've identified and how you handle those relationships, then how do you represent the relationships on the ERDs and the RMDs, then we go to what we call the physical database design. So here they're saying once the logical design has been produced by the database designer, then the implementation phase begins. Now this is where you sit on your computer, then you start designing the database using the relevant softwares. Now for our case, we are going to stick more on MySQL. So I'll show you how do we create databases using MySQL. So in the physical, this is where the real database design, as in writing or creating database, begins. So we create queries for the database, then maybe we create also forms that will be used to input information into our database. So we are saying during the physical design phase, the database designer sits on the computer and starts creating the database structure with all other required database components. We looked at these database components where we said we have the tables, forms, queries, data applications, to mention but the few. And we are saying this phase is tailored on a specific database management system, which is the DBMS. And for our sake, like I said, we are going to stick on MySQL. So far, those are the phases we go through to design a database. First, we have the conceptual, where you have the concept of what a database should look like. Then you ask yourself, what are the components that are required for the database you want to design? What are the functionalities you want the database to output? And maybe which people will use the database. Now that's having the concept of how your database will look like. Then after having the concept, then we go to the logical. Now the logical, this is where you identify the entities. Right? Now after identifying the entities, you ask yourselves these questions. You ask yourself the questions: is there any relationship between the entities that I have identified? And if the answer is yes, how would you handle those relationships? That's where we bring in the one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many relationships. Then after identifying the relationships and handling them, then we shall come to what we call the ERDs and the RMDs. So we also learn how to draw those diagrams, and all this is done under the logical database design phase. So after identifying the relationships, handling the relationships, and drawing the diagrams, then we come to the physical. This is where you sit on a computer, then you start designing the database. And we've said our main emphasis will be MySQL. So I will also show you how do we create databases using the MySQL console, then using the PHP MyAdmin. So now let us look at the stages of database development process. Basically, we have five stages. Number one, the user needs assessment. The user needs assessment and requirement gathering. So for you to be able to design a database, you first need to do assessment, and then you gather the requirements you need to design. So here saying the user needs assessment and requirements gathering. Determine what the user are looking for, what functions should be supported, how the system should behave. Now all those are requirements gathering in our first stage. So when you've gathered the user requirements, then we do what we call data modeling. So you're saying basing on the user requirements from stage 1, we form a logical model of the system, right? So you first gather the requirements, then you do the data modeling, whereby you form the logical model of the system. Now this logical model is then converted into a physical model. Now the logical model comprises of the entities, right? You've identified here. Now you ask yourself, is there any relationship between the entities identified? That is the logical. Now after identifying the relationships and handling those relationships, then you draw the RMDs and the RM and the ERDs. Then you convert the logical model into the physical data model. Those are the tables, the columns, you see, and the relationships that will be implemented. So we say number 1, you gather the user requirements, then you do the data modeling, and now when the data modeling is done, we go to the third stage, which is implementation. So now we are saying, basing on the data model above, a database can be created basing on the entities you've identified, the relationships that do exist in those entities. Then you can start creating a database. Now after creating database, this is implementation. After creating database, we test the database. So the system is tested using the real data. So you start inputting information to the database you've created, right? Then after doing that, we do what we call the deployment, whereby you give a system to the users to use the system in real time. So the system is deployed to users. Maintenance of the system begins. So basically, those 5 stages form what we call the database development process. We said you identify the requirements of the user, then you do what we call the data modeling, then we do what we call the implementation. When we do what we call the implementation, then we do what we call the testing, and lastly we do what we call the deployment. So basically, in today's lecture, we shall stop from there. So in our next lecture, we are going to look at this phase of the database design, the logical phase, into depth. So we shall learn how do we draw the how do we identify the entities, right? And after identifying the entities, how do we know that the relationships between those entities we've identified? And if we identify the relationships, how do we handle the relationships that do exist in the entities we've identified? So we shall stop from there. We meet in our next lecture. Stay safe and be blessed.